Hello everyone and welcome back to Farms Land Farms, and this is the sequel to my video on garden architecture and sequences. And the purpose of this video is to show a method of nomenclature to write down garden architecture. So throughout history there have been significant movements to create writing systems for different parts of reality. So you can think back all the way to, let's say, I don't know exactly when hieroglyphics started, but Egyptian hieroglyphics were one of the first written um, systems of communication. Then you had cuneiform, and I forget which came first, and I don't know if they both kind of popped up at the same time. And then you had the Phoenician alphabet, which was really the first alphabet as we know an alphabet, and so on. And you can picture someone in Egypt, Sumeria, or Phoenicia thinking, why are people wanting to write down thoughts or speeches or laws? They probably hated the fact that they actually had laws written down now, so you couldn't say, well, I forgot that that was the law. But there probably were people who were skeptical of the practicality of a writing system. Um, but we know today that it's very extremely convenient because you don't have to rely on a person's memory, which could be fallible. You don't have to rely on someone's word anymore, which they could be deliberately lying to you. You don't have to rely on oral stories, which could change over time. And not to knock oral tradition. Oral tradition is a very reliable method of communication in societies that practice it. And they have a lot of mnemonic devices to pass on that information. But still, at the end of the day, sometimes oral tradition could change. And the written word has been our bastion against all of those things happening. Whether it be hieroglyphics, cuneiform, or an alphabet or syllabary like Sequoia created for the Cherokee language, all of those systems were able to convey thoughts more easily. During the 1600s as well, there was also a movement to create a nomenclature for mathematics. Before what had happened, and if you read the history of algebra specifically, like with Diophantine equations and the works of Al-Khwarizmi, you have all of these word problems, and they were very interesting in how they created their equations because they didn't have equations; they just had word problems. And something would be like, if you have a square whose length is x, and then you have another square whose area is 2 times x, or excuse me, that would be a rectangle. And finally, you have this area known, which would be 4, solve for x. And that was the word problem. Excuse me, they didn't even have x back then. Of course, it was in Arabia where algebra was started. But Al-Khwarizmi would write things like that out. And that would be the equivalent of y equals x squared plus 2x plus 4. And then finally we got modern notation where we simply write y equals x squared plus 2x plus 4. And it made math extremely easier. And if you deny that, think of all of your high school algebra lessons. Instead of you solving equations with simple algebraic methods, instead you have to solve word problems all the time. Well, gardening is similar. So gardening garden architecture, how you build your garden, how are you going to convey that information to someone else? So we talked about what garden architecture was. And let's say we have a pea field. And that pea field, you planted each row 1 foot apart, and you had 6 inches between each plant. And of course that doesn't happen because germination rates are never 100%. And usually in order to account for that, you plant several seeds in the same hole. So really, you might have 4 plants in one hole and then no plant in the hole right beside of it. And that's completely fine. This is obviously an idealized scenario. How would you convey that information on paper? Would you write essentially a word problem? Hey, I planted peas 6 inches apart in 16-foot rows where each row was 1 foot apart. Or could you significantly simplify that? And in order to simplify that, at first, you would have to figure out the sequence. And sequence is what we talked about last week. Or at least in the last video. I don't know if I posted it last week or not. So you have to figure out the sequence. So what would the sequence be? Well, let's get to the basic thing. What are we planting? We're planting peas. And it would help if we had a symbol for the pea plant. Now, this could be anything. It could be whatever. It could be Greek letters. It could be Arabic letters. It could be part of the Cherokee alphabet. It could be random letters of our alphabet that we use today. Me personally, for the pea plant, I use a capital P with a smaller capital E. Okay? So that is my symbol for the pea plant. What else do I want to convey with this information in whatever symbolism, whatever nomenclature I'm going to use? Well, I want to convey that each pea plant is separated by 6 inches within the row. And the row in my system of notation is really the basic unit of the garden. So I'm going to put a little dash representing the space in between each plant. Okay? Then I'm simply going to put a 6. Give the little inch sign above it, and that represents 6 inches. So I have peas, 1 pea plant, and of course this is idealized. A space representing the space where idealistically there's no plant there. In reality, there's weeds. Hopefully you have a good control on your weeds. And then you have your 6 inches. And this, of course, is the same. So you have the 6 inches is telling you how long that dash really is in real life. And so this simply tells, this is a really good way of saying, hey, I'm planting my peas at 6 inches, spacing them apart. But there's more information I want to convey there. So the next would be, well, how much are you doing this in your row? Basically, how long is your row? First of all, I'm going to put an ellipse. And if you don't want to know what an ellipse is those dot, dot, dots that you see when someone hasn't finished. So this is just saying that it's just not 1 pea plant separated from a plant on one side by 6 inches. This actually is a sequence that repeats itself. So after this, this 1 pea plant separated by 6 inches from another plant, what is the next plant? It's going to be the same thing. It's going to be a pea plant. And what's going to be after that pea plant? Another 6 inches of no plants. And then what's going to be after that 6 inches of no plants is going to be another pea plant. And it just keeps going. So this is our basic sequence, okay? But like I said, we need to know how many times this sequence repeats itself. So here you have to do a little bit of math. You have to figure out how many, this is your spacing, got to figure out how many plants based on your spacing could you fit in however long your row is. So let's make this easy. Let's say our row is 10 foot long. So how many times does 6 inches go into 10 feet? Well, 6 inches is half a foot, which means 10 divided by half is 20. So I can repeat this sequence 20 times until I get to the end of the row, and then that'll be it. Now, of course, once you get to the 20th pea plant, the sequence, because it ends not on the pea but on the 6 inches of no plant, that gets tagged on in too. So you got to remember, if you're doing a little bit more complicated garden architectures, that you still have that excess space. But for our purposes, and for like if you're just planting a row of peas, that doesn't matter. It just tells you that there would be a plant if there was a 21st pea plant. But because there's only 20 pea plants, that 6 inches is just kind of superficial. So there's your basic, your second, like the second level of your basic garden architecture, telling you how many times you plant the sequence. So I'm going to take that piece of paper off, lay it down. I'm going to write the garden architecture we just talked about, because there's more to this. Because the last piece of information we got to add is how far the rows are apart, or how far is the inter-row space. To make it easy, let's say it's a foot. So all we're going to do, and this is perhaps the simplest part of it, just going to put 1 foot below the 20 open parentheses PE dash 6 inches ellipse close parentheses. And if we wanted to, we could also write it like this: 20 open parentheses PE dash 6 inches ellipse close parentheses slash 1 foot. And there's our garden architecture, two-dimensionally. So this, the 20 open parentheses PE dash 6 inches ellipse close parentheses, that's our just linear garden architecture, or it's two-dimensional. One dimension would just be a point, but two-dimension is a line. This is three-dimensional, so it has yes, it would be two-dimensional, sorry. Because you have an X and Y axis for this. So your X axis would be this right here. And then your Y axis would be this. But we're not done yet, because assuming you have a garden that's bigger than 1 row, you probably need to say how many rows you're going to have. There's another part to that. I'm going to put that down. I'm going to write out our garden architecture. So if you remember high school algebra, there's notation to parentheses and how to enclose different sets of things that you're operating on. So we have our parentheses. The next step up would be brackets. So I'm going to use brackets. So that's saying that this is a sequence, a garden sequence that we're going to repeat. A two-dimensional garden sequence that we're going to repeat. Let's say we have 10 rows. So we're repeating this sequence 10 times. So all we do is put 10 in front of the brackets, and that is the garden architecture written out for a plot of peas. So the reason this is important, at least I think it's important, is because instead of telling you a long drawn out sentence, or relatively long, hey, I'm planting 10 rows, 10-foot rows of peas spaced at 6 inches apart in the row, with inter-row space being 1 foot. All I have to do is write this out and you can plant accordingly. It's kind of like doing a math problem. Instead of saying 4 plus 4 equals 8, you write down these little symbols that represent 4 and another 4 in addition in the middle, and equality in between with the equal sign, and then the number 8 on the other side. And hopefully this does the same for gardening. And so this kind of lets you know the ways I'll be explaining things in future videos on gardening. If you have any questions about my system, or if you have any comments about my philosophy in actually creating a system like this, feel free to post in the comments. Thank you, and I hope you have a great night. Bye, guys.